Alright, welcome back everybody. This is McCall again with TwoWheels Productions, and I'm bringing you another Photoshop tutorial. It's been a little while since my last one because there hasn't been a high demand for the tutorials that I've been creating, but I decided to go ahead and just make a basic Photoshop tutorial out there just so you guys can kind of understand how Photoshop works if you're on that beginner level. So let's go ahead and begin by opening up Photoshop. Now I use Photoshop Creative Cloud. And if you guys are using CS6, it's pretty much the same thing. Although Creative Cloud, I still highly recommend it because updates come a little quicker. And I think it's phenomenal. And it's got a great price and whatnot. So anyways, we are going to go ahead and add our first photo. Now today, I'm going to show you how to edit a RAW and a JPEG photo. So we're going to go ahead and start with the RAW. So let's go to File, Open. And we're going to go to our desktop here, and as you can see, this NEF here, that's a Nikon RAW photo right there. And this is what we're going to start editing. Now, obviously, you can choose File, Open this way, or you can simply open up Finder and drag and drop it into your timeline. Either way, it'll work and do the same thing. Now you're probably wondering, whoa, why did Photoshop change? Well, by default, whenever you drag and drop or open a RAW photo, you are automatically going to open up what's called the Camera Raw filter. And this is actually where you can probably do 90% of your Photoshop color adjustments and work on your standard photos, and they come out great. So as you can see here on your right side, you have a little menu over here out to the side. So right now, you can see your basics: temperature, tint, exposure, contrast, and etc. You can also choose curves. You got your details such as noise reduction, sharpening. You can do your hue, saturation, and many other things you can choose from over here, including presets. As you can see, I have 3 different presets over here on the side that I typically use. So we're just going to start with the basic here. So with this photo, this isn't a bad photo of Hunter McCall. As you can see here, he's getting ready to, launch here at Freestone MX. I can see right now from this photo, there's a little too much blue in here. I would like to make it a little bit warmer. So I'm just going to start with just temperature and just go up a little bit. And it's what you'll see me do is I typically like to bring up the temperature past what I actually think is good, and I'll bring it back down. So to me, that's too warm. So I just want to see what it looks like. So now I'm going to bring it back down just a little bit. There we go. That's looking about right. Once we bring up the purple tint a little bit, that's going to even that out a little bit. There we go. Starting to look more like an evening kind of setting now. As far as exposure goes, this can be kind of tricky because you definitely don't want to overexpose the image, but also you don't want to make it darker, make it look like, he's doing a moonlight race here. But I would like to maybe just do half, maybe a quarter stop. There we go, about a quarter stop above. Contrast, if we're going for an evening kind of setting here, I want to bring up the contrast just a little bit, just a hair. And this is where a lot of people go wrong. I see a lot of people go wrong here with the contrast and shadows. One thing you want to be careful about is if you bring a lot of contrast, that's really going to make your photo very punchy. And that's something that you typically see in such as like a Nike sports shoot or something like that. Something very punchy and like just broad. And you really want to watch out from that. And as far as shadows go, I see a lot of people bringing up shadows like this in a contrast, and they think that's a wonderful photo. And although that looks better than your typical iPhone photo, if you're trying to get into photography and maybe make a little bit of money at it, you cannot do that with all your images. So let's just undo that. So back to where we were. Now highlights, you want to pay extra careful attention to your highlights because these are basically the overexposed areas of the image. As you can see, it's only affecting the whites. To me, that looks a little better than the slightly overexposed look. So I'm going to keep it right about there, about -25. Shadows, let's see what it looks like with darker shadows than now with brighter. To me, Whenever you bring up the shadows, that typically makes it more of what I call a happy image. You typically have your happy and kind of dark images. So with your shadows, when you typically bring them up, they become more of what I consider a happy image rather than a dark image, kind of cinematic looking. I kind of want to go for that more what I call a happy image here. And you see, if you bring down your highlights and you bring up your whites, you're kind of almost defeating the purpose of bringing down your highlights. So typically you want to send these in the same direction. Maybe not quite as much, but typically you want to send them in the same direction, highlights and whites. And your blacks, this is pretty straightforward. If you guys are having some black in your image, such as, this guy's shirt right here, the tires on these dirt bikes here, obviously they're muddy, but the tire is still black. I almost always bring down the blacks just a little bit. I hardly ever go past -10 though. Right there, that would do it for me. We're basically just, instead of giving that kind of matte gray look, you're just bringing it down just a hint. And then you have your clarity here. Now, do not be confused with clarity. This is not sharpening. Sharpening will be on this third little submenu right here under detail. Clarity is basically, are you looking for a softer image, or are you looking for that more what I call punchy image, such as the Nike shoots that I was talking about earlier. So something else I see a lot of people do is this. And all of a sudden that makes it look like a wonderful photo, I guess. This is what a lot of people are typically doing over Instagram and whatnot. And to me, yes, sometimes a very sharp and crisp image like this can make something punch, but you need to be careful with the way you use that, because that's not, that's kind of taking away from the photo. I feel like there's so much going on back here. I'm not even paying attention to Hunter right now. So let's bring that back to 0 and let's take it up just a little bit. That looks good. That looks just fine right there. And then obviously you have your vibrance and saturation. Now, if you bring the vibrance up, you're typically going to see a kind of like a slider increase of color change. As for the saturation, if you bring that up, it looks like, all the color becomes enhanced a lot more quickly. So I like to be careful with that. So saturation is going to bring up that color and really make it pop and stand out. So I just do, very few touches on this at all. That looks good. So just on a side note, you want to be especially careful with what kind of monitor you're using, as well as the color display of it. I typically use all Apple products, and I've noticed that their display seems to give me the best overall final product for what it's going to look like across multiple devices, whether you're looking at the photo or video from an iPhone, smartphone, your iPad or another tablet, YouTube, or you're throwing it up on your big TV or whatever. You obviously can adjust color settings in just about every monitor these days, but you want to be careful because if you have high contrast and you have a very vibrant monitor, then whenever you make very small adjustments and you crank up that vibrance a little bit or whatever, it's still not going to look as vibrant on someone else's monitor. So just keep that in mind. So anyways, getting back at it. So to me, this is a pretty typical way that I edit raw photos. If I'm not trying to get very serious into them, that looks pretty good. Now we're going to continue to move along here. So then you got your curves. And honestly, since we're just kind of doing a beginner tutorial here, honestly, it's just something you got to mess around with. You just got to get used to it. So you notice you're seeing highlights, lights, darks, and shadows, kind of like what we saw back here. You're seeing highlights, you're seeing blacks, and there's your shadows right there. Now, to me, you really need to finish up the basic setting before you move along to the tone curve. The reason is because whether you bring down or bring up your highlights, you can actually further adjust or enhance them here. So I usually make just slight adjustments here. Actually, I should probably go dark for this one. I'm gonna bring the darks down just a little bit. Shadows down, maybe just to stop. So essentially, maybe you're not seeing a drastic difference here, but I will do a before and after of this photo whenever we're completely finished. Then now you're reaching the sharpening. Now, once again, do not get confused with clarity, because this is not the same thing, but sharpening basically just sharpens up the photo. It enhances the lines around the images. You can see little lines around here whenever you enhance it a lot. I typically bring it up hardly no more than 50, but because obviously I'm not going for that Nike shoot look. And obviously your noise reduction, this is something else you have to mess with. Be careful with it, because if you do go, I notice if you go much past 15 to 20, you start getting a very milky look in your images. Now, there's not a lot of noise in this photo, so you're not seeing a big difference, but you can still see on Hunter's face here, look how soft it's making it compared to no noise reduction. So just make sure you're especially careful with that. Okay, moving on. So here, this is your, I just kind of call them color charts. So you have your luminance. You can change how bright each color you want it to be. You can change the saturation of each color, and obviously the hue. So I personally don't really want to mess around with the saturation, because I want to see all of these colors. I'm not really trying to make Hunter just stand out among everything else. I want to see all these colors. I want to show him on the starting gate of Freestone MX, which is a huge national. So something I might do is the luminance, though. I might want to bring those reds up just a little bit, because it's looking pretty dark here on his helmet. You'll want to be very careful whenever you're adjusting a red. Well, the next closest color to that is orange. So typically if you adjust one color, you have to do the next, and then the next, and then the next. That's kind of typical. So if I bring the reds up, I'm generally bringing the orange up as well, because if I bring them all the way up to white and I'm bringing the orange down, you'll get some weird looks where those colors cross. So that looks pretty good to me. I'm just going to leave it at that. We're not trying to get too far in depth with this stuff. Split toning, once again, you can adjust the hue and saturation of the photo, and you can adjust the shadows. So if you want the shadows to have a red look, green look, and this is something that I use pretty often if I'm looking for a cinematic look, maybe not that much saturation, but you'll see me bring up the greens and the shadows if I'm trying to make a cinematic look in a photo. But that's pretty straightforward. That's just something you have to mess around with. So now you're at lens corrections. Now you cannot use this if it's a JPEG photo, because a JPEG gets rid of all of the basically in-camera settings, and the raw photos, they hold more than just a photo. They can tell you what focal length you're at, your exposure, your ISO, your shutter speed. They give you all these different they can give you all this kind of information about it. So let's go ahead and enable lens profile corrections. So obviously, boom, you saw a big difference right there. Basically, is what just happened was it enhanced the photo by realizing that there was basically just the opposite of a fisheye going on. It had a concave kind of look, so it convexed the photo just a little bit to flatten it out, to kind of smooth out the photo, to basically see what our eyes can see. You can also see that it took away the vignetting, so you can see around here the slight dark edges. There's just a little bit of vignetting going on. looks like it was a 55 to 300 mil Nikkor lens. And there's a little bit of vignetting going on, but I actually want to keep that on so I can turn the vignetting back on if I wish. So you can do that, and here's the distortion, what it did. So this is what it was like, and it basically just brought up to a neutral stage. Okay, so we're gonna move along, and here we go under effects. This is where you can add grain. And dehaze was actually a new update that just recently came out in Photoshop. So you can give it a cloudy, kind of smoky look, hazy, or you can kind of enhance it and give it a more contrasty look. But I'm very careful when I use this. I don't think I've gone anywhere past about 5 stops in either direction because it's very strong. Vignetting, I use this tool almost every time I'm shooting a photo and editing it on Photoshop. Obviously, if you're going for a white vignette or a black one, you go, whichever way you want on the scale. Your midpoint is basically going to be where the vignette kind of starts. So if I want to enhance it more on Dauber here, I'm going to bring it down. And as you can see, now all of this is kind of black. Your roundness, this is going to change. Do you want it more of a round vignette? Do you want it more of an oval? Do you want it more of a square? And you just kind of have to play around with it. As you can see what I'm doing right here, it's pretty typical of me to do, just kind of mess around with it like that. In your feather, obviously, how much of a fade do you want? So this is a little too strong for me, so I usually break it up by throwing that feather as far to the right as I can. And if you're looking for, I don't know why you would, but if you want like an oval where you can actually see the end of the vignette, then I guess you could go the other way, but I try to get as smooth as the transition as possible. And highlights, this is basically just taking the vignette out of the highlights. So there we go. And I'm not going to talk too much about this because this is essentially what you were doing back here, just more in depth. It's just straightforward. Your shadows, you can tint your shadows, your red, green, and blue primaries. Just mess around with those. And here are your presets. All you have to do is, if you were editing multiple photos and you didn't have Lightroom and you wanted this effect to go across all of them, then all you have to do is just hit that button, choose what settings you want to apply, push OK, and you will have that preset over there, and you just click on it, and it's as simple as that. And then there's snapshots. So that is essentially how you will edit a photo in Photoshop RAW. So now you click done. So that is essentially how you would edit a photo in Photoshop RAW. So now we're going to click Open Image. And as Photoshop processes that, it's going to apply all of it. And there we go, there's the photo. And now you can further enhance it, going into, whatever filters you want to apply and whatnot and stuff like that, add text to it. If you wanted to go back into Photoshop RAW, you can click Filter and Camera Raw Filter. And that takes you right back to where we were, just like so. So I'm just going to kind of show you the basics around Photoshop. No, not yet. So that's essentially how I would edit a photo. And basically, whenever I'm finished with it, I'm just going to go to File and Save As. And we're just going to go on Desktop here. And here's your format. So if you want to save it as a Photoshop file, if you're not finished with it and you want to pick it back up later, then definitely save it as that. You don't want to go to JPEG because that's going to compress the image and you won't be able to basically reapply or take away any filters or adjustments you made here's a Photoshop RAW filter if you want to keep it as a RAW file so you can further manipulate the colors and whatnot. But generally, it's between JPEG or a Photoshop format. And those are the two formats you really ever need to save in. A PNG if you want to keep the background clear, if you had an erasable background. But we're just going to do a JPEG. And just save it, and it chooses, or it gives you the option, do you want to make it a large file? Obviously, you generally want the highest quality possible. Click OK. And that is how you edit a raw photo in Photoshop CC. So now we're going to move along to a JPEG. Now, really, I'm essentially doing the same thing. I'm going to do the drag and drop feature this time. So I'm just going to go to Finder. And here's the image that we're going to edit. As you can see, .jpg, that is a JPEG. So I'm just going to drag it over like so, and there it is, boom. So essentially, once I'm ready to start editing the JPEG file, I just go back into the camera raw filter, and I will apply the same things that we did to the raw photo. Now, this is what's different about a JPEG and that you need to pay attention to. Obviously, some of your little submenus are missing because it's not a raw photo. You're not going to be able to do as much with it. With that being said, JPEGs, they are compressed images, so it's much harder to manipulate the color in these photos rather than a raw file. So I am really going to push the extremes of this photo. Just keep in mind, this is not what you want to do. Now I'm going to show you what I mean by compressed images. So as we crank up the saturation, what are you starting to see? Well, as you look on my forehead here, you're getting a very blotchy look here. You're seeing some discoloration in the black curtains here. You're just really not getting a good photo at all. You can see this purple and green tint going on over here. Hunter, he's getting that splotchy look too. His helmet, we pretty much lost all detail right here on his visor. It just looks like orange paint, essentially. As when I bring it back down, now you can see a little bit of detail again. But this is really, let's take a zoom in here. So with this being a JPEG, it's basically you're getting a lot of artifacts in here. As you can see, the pixelation going on back here and around the edge of the visor. It's really just a compressed image that's used to be good for storage. If you're going on a shoot and you're backpacking in the mountains and you only have one SD card and you want to shoot thousands of photos, and you're not really trying to edit them over Photoshop, that's what a JPEG is for. A JPEG is also for sharing. If you just want to take a photo just to share it on Instagram real quick and use a Wi-Fi transmitter from your DSLR, that's what a JPEG is for. You really do not want to shoot JPEG if you are going to be manipulating these photos in Photoshop or printing them. I highly recommend raw photos. I actually cannot remember the last time I shot JPEG because I put all of my photos through the Photoshop process. So getting back on track here, essentially, whenever you enhance these photos in Photoshop and it's a JPEG, you're really just losing a lot of details. Obviously you can edit them in Photoshop, as I still do. You can enhance the photos, but it's much harder to do so because there's not as much information for Photoshop to manipulate. So as you can see, I crank up the highlights and it just looks milky around us. The blacks, you can see just all these little artifacts back here along the curtains. So obviously, like I said, yes, I was pushing this photo to the extremes, but I'm just showing you the difference between the RAW and the JPEG. So I'm just going to cancel this. You guys pretty much understand that now. And that's it for the JPEGs. Just make sure that if you shoot a JPEG and you need to edit it in Photoshop, you need to be very careful with basically how far you're pushing the limits of that photo. So that's it with a JPEG. So I'm just going to kind of go through here. Now, a lot of this stuff is going to be grayed out because you don't have a photo in here yet. Let's go ahead and add a photo just so we can go through that menu, and that stuff won't be grayed out. So in here, at the top, and obviously I'm on Mac, and if you guys are on PC, it may be slightly different. I'm just showing you what it's like from a Mac, but this is still basically the same layout. This is where you can find all your settings for Photoshop, and then you go to File. This is how you export and save and open files and whatnot. Pretty straightforward there. Now edit, don't be confused with this, because basically edit is more like physical things with the photo. Like, do you want to paste onto it? Do you want to copy? Do you want to purge it? Do you want to edit the menus of Photoshop? Like, it's not really about editing the photo. You want to go over to image if you want to start editing colors and whatnot. You know, under image, you can go to mode. You can choose what kind of how many bits per channel you want, your color layout. You can adjust the photo. Obviously you can do your auto correct stuff, you know, auto tone, auto contrast, auto color. Now, something I am going to go into is canvas size. Now, this photo is like a 4:3 ratio or something pretty close to it. Now, most TV screens are 1920 by 1080. That's the resolution, and that's a 16:9 aspect ratio. So if I go to canvas size here, that's inches, let's go to pixels. This is how wide and how tall my photo is. You can see that right there, and that is not 1920 by 1080. It doesn't look like it at all. So if you wanted to, let's say, add, you know, let's just say you wanted some text here on the side that said Lane and Hunter, then, you know, you can essentially widen out your photo. So let's just type 4,000 pixels, and there you go. You have enough space to type whatever you want right there and right here. So just kind of throwing that out there. So let's erase that. Image rotation, you know, that's straightforward. Now layering. Now this is something that's very confusing, and this is just when practice comes in handy, you know. You're not just going to be able to jump into Photoshop after a week of owning it and, you know, expect to create fantastic photos right off the bat without any kind of frustration, because that's not how it works. Essentially, whenever you add a photo to, I know this isn't necessarily correct, but I'm just going to call it the timeline. You're creating layers over here. So if I have multiple photos, now I basically just duplicated those. You're just creating layers, and you can drag and drop the layers like so. Now this one's locked. You have to unlock that if you want to move that one around as well. And that's now you can see once I enabled and created more layers, more of these menus became available. There's a lot of stuff to go into with these layers. Now I'm not really going to get too far into that because that's more on the advanced side of Photoshop. We're just going to try to keep this on the beginner side. Let's go over to the type tab. And this is once again pretty straightforward. Once you start typing some text into your photos, you can do some stuff in here. Extrude to 3D. That's how you make the 3D font. Select all. That's just, what photos you want to select. Because, like I said, you're going to be having multiple layers over here, and it can get pretty confusing what layer you're working on. So that's why this tab comes in handy. And then here's the filter tab. This is essentially kind of like the image where you can adjust things on your photos. There's the camera raw filter. You can liquefy the image, which is a very common technique for advanced Photoshop, like studio shoots and whatnot. You can add some blur to your photo. Let's just go kind of crazy here, just like that. There's a lot of stuff you can do in here. Shake reduction works pretty well in Photoshop. I'm just going to click OK. Just do the default. You can see a slight difference there. It enhanced it a little bit, and it works pretty well. We're just going to move along to 3D. Most of this is grayed out because I don't have any text or objects in here, but if I just want to type something real quick, let's make the font a little bigger. Hello. So there we go. Now I can go to this tab, but I'm just going to click right here, the little shortcut that I made. So I type hello and I can start dragging it around. Now this was really confusing for me at first, how to move this stuff around. It took me a little while to understand it. But if you see down here in the bottom left, all you have to do is hover over one of the basically menu items, icons, whatever you want to call them. You need to hover over them, the one that you want to do. So if I want to orbit the object, just click and start orbiting, like so. If I want to pan the camera, do that. And if I want to dolly it, make it bigger or smaller, then obviously hover over that option and, you know, click down and do that. You can't do all of it from up here. So anyways, that's that. Go back into layers, and remember, whenever you go to a 3D photo or object, it by default goes to a 3D workspace. So you may be like, oh no, what happened to my layers? You know, just choose the layers tab, and you're back to where you were essentially. So I'm just going to delete that. View, this is basically just how you view the photo. You know, if you want to zoom in, zoom out, print size, screen mode, you want to go full screen, you know, just stuff like that. If you go to full screen, it's probably going to hide these tabs. That's what mine does. Window, you can choose your most common items that you use, and they will be displayed somewhere in Photoshop. I like to, and what I highly recommend is going to Workspace and creating a new workspace. I generally go to the photography like that, and if you have dual monitors, you know, choose what you know, tables and tabs you want on which monitor. That's something that I highly recommend, and that's if you need help. So I basically just made a real quick video to walk you guys through Photoshop and kind of show you what it's like. I didn't go into real big detail about most of this stuff because it's something that just takes practice, as you can see here. Okay, let's wait. So now I pretty much walked you through all the tabs that you have here on the top of Photoshop. Now here on the side you have more icons, and within these icons you have even more icons. So if you click and hold down and go over to the right, you know, you can choose even more options out of these. Essentially, I want to say they're straightforward, but they're really not, because it's something you just have to understand. The Lasso tool, that's a way that you can like select items and cut them out, you know, like so. I mean, it's kind of hard to learn because it's something that you have to remember. Well, what does this do? What does this one do? The Polygon Lasso tool is pretty much the same thing, except you just click down, you know. You'll get used to it after a little bit of practice though. You have the magic wand tool, which is basically highlighting edges. That's how you can delete backgrounds like that. Obviously that's a really crappy job, but you could layer it. Let's just to kind of show you what I'm talking about. See, I just layered that because I deleted all that stuff back there. Gosh, that looks awful. And then you have the quick selection tool, which gives you a little bit more customization, I think, of how you can delete stuff. Obviously still a crappy job, but you're getting the point. And you can actually select, you know, how soft and hard you want the edges of these tools as well, right up here. Whenever you select on them, they give you more options up here. So yeah, essentially, it's just, like I said, just something you just kind of got to work with. This is the spot healing brush. This is the healing brush. So, whoops, I clicked the wrong one. So the spot healing brush, you can use this a lot. If you're trying to clear up somebody's face, with blemishes, pimples, and whatnot. Let's just get rid of something here, like this dip on my chin. Get rid of that. So essentially, the spot healing brush is what you would use if you want to get rid of blemishes and whatnot on people's faces, bodies. And it can work in the background of objects if you want to take out a bird in the sky or something like that. It does a pretty good job of getting rid of that stuff. All it really does, though, is just take a different part of the photo. So as you can see, I'm just kind of smearing it around. And yeah, I got rid of that image, but if you really were zooming in on this and if it was a nice image, you could realize that there's kind of a smear mark going on here. Well, this is a crappy image, so you can't really tell, but now you can see something's going on here. So essentially all it's doing is taking different pieces of the photos nearby and replacing the skin with a different part of my forehead. Okay. So that's it. I'm going to skip most of these tools. The type tool, that's pretty common. Choose your own horizontal, vertical type. Click there, choose your font size, type something, and make sure you click the check mark. And a good shortcut to learn is Command T. You can do that with all images, and that's how you resize. And it took me forever to understand most of these shortcuts, but if you ever get tired of trying to scale these up and keep them to scale, as in not fat and skinny like that, just hold shift at the same time and it drags them up in scale, all uniform. Make sure you release click before you release shift, or else you will do this. You'll be scaling it up and then you'll go. So just pay attention to that. If you want to recolor something, you can highlight one of the layers over here and double click. Color overlay. This is another kind of menu inside of Photoshop. You can adjust your glow on images and stuff like that. And I use this stuff pretty often, as you can see here. I'm just messing around with it. A lot of stuff to do in Photoshop, but I believe I've covered most of it. The rest of this stuff is just pretty straightforward. So with that being said, I pretty much just walked you through all the basics of how to edit a JPEG, how to edit a RAW photo, and showed you around Photoshop a little bit. I didn't get too in depth on all of it because it really just takes practice, and I want to save the more kind of hardcore stuff for an advanced tutorial that I will do later on down the road. But that should get you started for now, kind of get your brain working to understand how Photoshop works. It works in layers. Just pay attention to your layers on the side and which layer selected and which filters applying to which layer. It's just going to take some practice, but within about a month, I was able to use Photoshop consistently and understand, I actually understood how it was working. So if you did like this tutorial, just make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos. So for TwoWheels Productions, I'm McCall. Wow, 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 wow.